Getting around Massachusetts without a car can be a bit of a puzzle. Sure, you can haul yourself from one side to the other through a combination of MBTA subways, commuter rail, and local bus networks, but it can start to feel like a cross-country schlep more than a smooth in-state trip. Well, a combination of state and federal muscle is being directed over the next decade at an intercity and interstate rail system, including the long-awaited West-East Rail. It's poised to impact commuting patterns and shape housing growth across the state at a time when both transit and livability are essential to retaining Massachusetts residents. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined in Talking Trains by Andy Koziol, the relatively newly appointed Director of West-East Rail, and MassDOT's Rail and Transit Division Administrator, Meredith Slesinger. Andy, Meredith, thank you so much for coming on the Codcast.
We're excited to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So we're here to talk about West-East Rail, or East-West Rail, but I understand that the terminology we prefer is West-East Rail. Andy, why don't you start us off by sort of explaining what is West-East Rail and kind of broadly what the timeline looks like, and then we can feel free to jump in and out on any details.
West-East Rail is a component of what we call Compass Rail, which is our overall vision for intercity passenger rail within Massachusetts. Now, intercity passenger rail is a little bit different than commuter rail, where this is longer distance, generally connecting metro areas. This is Amtrak-operated services. Compass Rail is a combination of existing passenger rail services, which is like the north-south services in western Massachusetts from New Haven up to Springfield, Greenfield, to points north, to points south. West-East Rail represents the proposed or upcoming pieces of the expansion of Compass Rail. So that would be the West-East corridor from Boston to Albany. Now, West-East Rail, this is going to bring new connectivity, new opportunities for mobility, particularly for Western Massachusetts to Eastern Massachusetts. It'll give us an opportunity to connect some of our more rural communities to urban economic job centers in the East.
So, Meredith, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the history of this project and how it fits into MassDOT's broader rail system plans here. Andy ran us through essentially what the kind of connection points are and what the ultimate goal is, but how did this come to be? If, for instance, you're out here in Eastern Massachusetts and had not really thought about what it might mean to have rapid transit to and from the western parts of the state.
You know, all rail projects tend to happen incrementally over time. So I like to joke that there are no new ideas in rail. I think there's been a desire for, Boston to Albany or east-west service for a very long time. Historically, that service did exist once, way back in the day. We still have one train a day between Boston and Albany. However, it's not necessarily a useful train. It's part of Amtrak's long-distance network. So a daily train isn't necessarily going to be serving the economic needs and the transportation needs on a daily basis for these communities. So over the past about 15 years, we've been spending a lot of time investing in our north-south Knowledge Corridor or Connecticut River Line services. That includes the Vermonter, the Amtrak Hartford line. And in 2019, we introduced the Valley Flyer. These services have grown incrementally over time, and over the past about 15 years, we've been making incremental infrastructure investments and at key times acquiring rail right-of-way in order to have effective passenger rail service. And we've been partnering with Amtrak, our neighbors in Connecticut and Vermont, in order to grow these services. We've been progressing incrementally, and we also realize that it needs to fit in with a larger vision of how are we going to move people in the future. We know, and I'll quote my highway administrator colleague, that single occupancy vehicles are the worst use of highways and least efficient, obviously least environmentally friendly. The future is rail. This administration is really focused on our climate future and how we are going to live and move and work in an environment where we have the constraints that we're going to have given climate change and what we have coming at us.
So how has MassDOT been thinking about the potential demand here? You note that, for instance, we have the single day rail option if you're trying to get from, say, Boston to Albany. But with rail, not just light rail, but also all of our other systems, there is often a chicken and egg question, which is, do you build for future demand to incentivize demand, or is there a current demand that's not already being met? In the context of West-East Rail, what has MassDOT been seeing in terms of kind of an eagerness to use these routes versus the idea that you might be able to incentivize leaving cars to use this rail network if it becomes available?
We really have to credit the local communities and their representatives on our federal delegation in terms of giving us the momentum in order to pursue these projects. The demand has come locally, and we are being really responsive to that. We have seen over the past several years that the services coming back after COVID in 2019, our north-south services in terms of ridership has doubled. So we know that when we've added or tweaked service to have more attractive travel time, that people are riding these services and they are using them. We just get asked for more and more. So we have seen the growth in the numbers. We have heard from the communities, and we are being as responsive as we can to the demand that's been generated.
Yes, I can add that. So as I mentioned earlier, we've had existing intercity passenger rail services in Western Massachusetts for several years now. The growth that we've seen on those lines has really been incredible. It's been outpacing our forecasts. We are well beyond the pre-pandemic ridership numbers that we've had. And that's actually pretty consistent with what we've seen with intercity rail. So intercity rail is different. It's a different profile of users than a commuter rail service that you might see like the MBTA or like MTA services, something that's more focused on getting from suburban locations to that economic core. So we have seen a real demand for service in Western Massachusetts, and a lot of that is long distance. So from like a Springfield or Northampton all the way to New York City or beyond to Washington, D.C. So we see that demand for intercity services. We think that bodes well for expansion within Massachusetts. And there's probably a lot of reasons that go into that. Post-COVID, work patterns has definitely changed, where people can start living further away than where they work if they only have to go in for a couple days a week, let's say. So we're keeping an eye on these travel patterns and how they play out over time, and trying to be responsive by giving mobility options that suit people's needs.
And how are you factoring in West East Rail's interaction with other transit options? We've done a Codcast in the past about the rise of microtransit, especially out in areas that are mostly served by regional transit authorities, which are kind of regional networks, not specifically the MBTA. What's the thinking in terms of what new hubs and spokes West East Rail will open up versus what new demand it will end up creating for these other potential regional transit authority or microtransit expansions? So the ripple effect of West East Transit as it relates to other transit options.
Obviously a characteristic of intercity rails that it connects these metro regions. And we really are envisioning Compass with Springfield as the hub. We have a cute little logo for that. So the regional transit authorities are going to be an important component in and around where we have station stops in terms of that first and last mile connection and all of the services that we provide. And we've seen this with our Berkshire Flyer pilot that we're doing between New York and Pittsfield. That last mile and that first mile transit connection is really critical. And so as we move forward in the planning phases, we will be continuing to work with the RTAs and those relevant locations in order to ensure that we have solid connectivity between the different types of services.
You mentioned, of course, Meredith, that there's the planning phase that is, of course, still in progress. I think before we get too far into this podcast, we should probably talk about when we are thinking about seeing any of these particular projects unroll. It's incremental, but it is currently in progress. It is currently ongoing. So, Andy, you are the new head of West East Rail for MassDOT. What's the timeline actually look like here?
So it will be an incremental process. You have that right. And the first real investment that's going to be seen by the public is the inland route. And that's going to be the early actions for the inland route. The inland route is a service that operates between Boston and New Haven, Connecticut, through Worcester and Springfield south to New Haven. So right now we have a $108 million federal grant that will allow us to conduct track work and improve the tracks between Worcester and Springfield, which will enable us to operate 2 daily passenger rail round trips. Right now, that project is going into design, and in 2027, we will begin construction with an anticipated completion in 2029. So those first 2 round trips will begin in the year 2029. Now, beyond that particular route, the inland route, the other West-East Rail corridor that we are advancing right now is the Boston and Albany corridor. Now, the Boston and Albany corridor, it's going to mirror pretty similar to the Boston to Pittsfield section that was studied through MassDOT's 2021 West Passenger Rail Study, but then an extension to Albany. And a big reason for that is a characteristic of the intercity rail is really to connect these metro areas. And I think it's worth pointing out, too, that when we are advancing these initiatives, particularly something like a Boston to Albany, it's within a general or a larger context of a nationwide network. So the Federal Railroad Administration has established what they call the Corridor ID program. And that's really a program to nationally build the connections that we have between our different cities and invest in our rail corridor. So the Boston to Albany corridor is a part of that inaugural class of corridors to be advanced. And it begins with planning. It begins with a service development plan, and we hope to be beginning that by the end of this year. At the conclusion of that service development planning effort for Boston Albany, we're going to end up with a program of projects that will be advanced, and those will be enabling projects to achieve the service that we determine we need. So like the number of round trips that we're going to have. This is a new program. The FRA, Federal Railroad, has not conducted this before, so the timeline on these longer distance services to Albany are a little less certain as we work through that process, but we do feel confident that we're going to be advancing through this process later on this year.
Plenty of folks who have seen major infrastructure projects in Massachusetts might, feel a little shiver down their spine when they think about how long some of them go on, how expensive some of them can get. So I wonder if either of you can talk about how, as you're looking ahead on a pretty long timeline here, what potential barriers you're seeing to a smooth expansion, potential choke points, funding questions that you're going to need to answer as this project goes on. So run me through what kind of the cost ticket is going to be looking like for these various components, and where you're really keeping an eye on as things that could slow down or as these projects roll on.
I think it's really important to remember that in order for us to really do anything, the interagency partnership is absolutely critical. So most of the West-East Rail Corridor is owned by CSX, the freight transportation company, and the services are operated by Amtrak. So we've been working with CSX and as well with Amtrak to plan for these services. But it is important for everyone to remember that we're not constructing sort of the inland route project on right-of-way that we own. So we have to work with our partners in order to advance these projects. That also means we are a bit dependent on other parties to move things along in the timeline that we hope to. And so far, we've been having a wonderful relationship with them, particularly on the inland route project. Even before we won the grant, we had started doing the work to model out what the service needs and what the infrastructure would be required. So we've gotten off on the right track with those partners. And there are a lot of projects that also maybe don't sound super flashy, but really will help with the passenger rail service and the freight service moving forward. We just announced a project in West Springfield with the leadership of Congressman Neal to build a flyover. So we eliminate a bottleneck along that route that causes a lot of problems for freight service today and for vehicular traffic. So that's a small $20 million project, relatively speaking, to some of the other mega projects that we could talk about. But as we move along, implementing projects like that will really help advance the overall vision for Compass Rail.
Andy, did you want to add anything on kind of as you're watching the trajectory unfold where you're particularly keen to narrow in on any potential barriers?
Sure. I will mention that corridor capacity, so the amount of trains that can fit on the rail tracks from Boston to Albany, is going to be an ongoing challenge for advancing these projects. So while MassDOT does lead the future expansions for passenger rail, MassDOT is still very committed to strengthening the freight rail network within the Commonwealth. So as we expand passenger rail, we also want to make sure that we're not negatively impacting the way that freight rail can operate. So as an example, that inland route, that $108 million grant, which is going to really be over $130 million once you add in contributions from MassDOT and Amtrak, that's to enable these two daily round trip trains without impacting the CSX services. A lot of the track between Worcester, West Albany is single track. So there's no way for a train to pass another train. And we're going to be looking for opportunities where we can add that second track alongside the current mainline track. And that's going to be an expense. And where it can fit to modern standards is going to be a little bit different than where it did fit in historical context. Surely we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I think we can be pretty proud that we're so close to implementing these early actions between Springfield and Boston. And really, when we look at our ridership projections, at least that for the projects that went as far as Pittsfield, the bulk of the ridership really is on that segment from Springfield to Boston. So we're investing early on where the demand is the highest.
Meredith, you mentioned earlier how this fits in with greening efforts, climate change goals, that sort of thing, which obviously involves a shift away from single occupancy vehicles like cars. I wonder if you could talk about how the West East Rail project is approaching modernizing here. Right now, as we speak here in September, there are first moves toward electrifying certain parts of the commuter rail system. So explain what the actual trains and their functions and their power sources would look like at this stage on West East Rail and how that would connect to the state's climate goals.
We have been working with Amtrak and our partner states on the fleet planning. So we at this point anticipate that these services will utilize Amtrak's upcoming Aero fleet. And these are more fuel efficient than the Am fleet services that you see, now across the network. And these are expected to generate 90% less particulate emissions in diesel operations. We do always like to point out to people that mass transit is inherently green as it provides these new opportunities to shift travelers from personal vehicles to a shared mode. It's more efficient. One train can move a lot more people than one car. We do like to remind folks as we advance the greening efforts of both the fleet and potentially the infrastructure. Again, we don't own it generally, so that's not necessarily up to us. We're looking at all of the different ways that we can make progress because the do nothing option just isn't one.
And Andy, what you had talked about earlier is that this isn't just about how people are moving to and from a place, but also it necessarily, all of this is connected, will have impacts on housing production and housing hubs, the broader economics of a region. We are also right now, along with looking at the commuter rail electrification, also in the midst of a slow rolling process of encouraging greater density around transit hubs, around the commuter rail system, the MBTA system. So when you're thinking about the impacts of West East Rail, what does that look like on the housing demand front, movement patterns for those who live and work in different parts of Massachusetts? What are the ripple effects that you expect to see as this process unrolls?
Well, your mobility or a person's mobility options are really foundational to where they live and where they work. West East Rail is going to be transformative in that it gives additional opportunities for mobility, either where they're living now or to live somewhere else. You can't take a new job if you can't get to it. And we want to give people an opportunity to reach those economic opportunities that they deserve by offering this passenger rail service, offering these new links. We think that we're going to be connecting people to jobs, people to institutions, educational opportunities, to hospital visits, and even social connections as well. That said, it goes two ways. We're connecting people to jobs, but we're also, when people are in high cost housing markets, this is an opportunity to expand and go to move to lower cost housing markets that are also looking to develop. We have a lot of areas in Western Massachusetts that are looking to grow. There's several gateway cities that are within the vicinity or directly on a station on the Compass Rail network. This is an investment in gateway cities, and we know that developing gateway cities is a strategy for addressing the state's housing crisis.
And for those who aren't familiar, I'm sure a lot of MassInc associated folks do know, but of course, gateway cities, when we're talking about them, are these mid-sized urban centers that often had former industrial economies and are now kind of modernizing and moving into this sort of new modern space. So I wonder, are there any numbers associated with the growth models around West East Rail? Obviously, some of it will say, if you have access to this area, that might mean that there might be new demand for X many new units, but it can all be a little bit fuzzy and speculative. So do you have a sense of what the demand might be or what those shifts are in housing needs?
Intercity rail is a little different than commuter rail. So it's not going to be the same type of development that you would see around an MBTA station that has 20 round trips into Boston. We expect that these West East Rail routes will be closer to 5 to 6 round trips. And this is going to be sorted out as we go through our quarter ID service development planning. But the model of development will be different, but there's still an awful lot of opportunity for growth at any one of these areas, particularly the station areas.
The Healy-Driscoll administration has really put a focus on housing and economic opportunity and transportation together. And so those secretariats work together very closely. And we do, again, it's not just our rail partners, it's also our partners within government to make sure that we're getting to the right outcomes. I think it's also important to mention that the progress that we've been able to make is in large part due to the infrastructure bill signed by President Biden in 2021, which also really envisioned that transportation could be transformational for the communities around the country. So just on a level of scale, we're talking about investment that we just haven't seen before in rail. So we've really been able to take advantage of this opportunity. So the $66 billion for rail was, again, just unprecedented. And this is really what's going to make these transportation slash economic slash housing development opportunities come to fruition. It's really, the infrastructure bill really has been the game changer in terms of our ability to move these projects forward.
And inherent to this conversation is that balance between not just interstate rail, but also the balance between East and West Massachusetts and the ways that they connect to each other. So I wonder if Meredith perhaps, but Andy, you can jump in here as well, could talk about how this fits into the historic, but also modern understanding of where we invest our resources and where we invest our transit focus between Eastern Massachusetts and the very dense populations out here versus connecting it to the other side of the state. So how does this fit into the governance structure and the historic investment between Eastern and Western Massachusetts?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that I'm not from Massachusetts, so I definitely don't like to pit the east or west parts of the state against one another. I really think it's important for folks to take a step back and think about it as a network lens. These are a system of transportation modes that do need to work together to enable folks to travel from point A to point B. There are investments, again, because it's a network, that are really important actually in Boston to service in Western Massachusetts. In order for us to have quality service between Boston and Albany and Worcester, Springfield, Pittsfield along that route, we need more capacity at South Station in Boston. Likewise, in order to have the successful service closer to Albany, we need to make investments in the Pittsfield station. Originally, that was going to be funded by fair share funds. We did put it in our CIP. So those investments in Pittsfield are also really important to the network. So we don't really like to look at it as East-West investments in Eastern Massachusetts are not important to Western Massachusetts and vice versa. In order to have that network or system-wide lens and or to have efficient services, you really need to invest in the places along the entire rail line where capacity needs to be added, where infrastructure improvements need to be made, where we can double track to reduce bottlenecks and have more fluidity. So that's my dodge of an answer of it's not West versus East, it's how do we make the network work as a whole.
Well, I'm going to let you do a little bit of that dodge because I think the thing that I'm interested in ending on here is there's often a question about, what does this actually feel like for riders? How do you know if there's a smooth system at work? What does it feel like when all of these pieces are connecting coherently? So I'd like to end, if possible, on each of your personal history with transit and your normal commutes, how you would know as a rider as well as an administrator of this expansion if the system is working. Are you going to be riding it as much as you're riding your usual commuter routes?
I am a frequent transit rider. My commute is a bus ride to an MBTA commuter rail station into Boston. I think that my experience and my career in speaking with other transit riders, a few important factors rise to the top in what makes a successful transit system, and that's a fast, frequent, and reliable service. Internally, what we do when we evaluate our existing services in Western Massachusetts on a monthly basis, we look at key metrics. We look at ridership, on-time performance, and customer satisfaction, amongst other metrics. And these are really the metrics that are going to be driving us as we plan future services, because a service you have to be able to count on it, and it has to be useful. Beyond those particular metrics, there's other factors that come into play. How easy is the system to use? So, for example, we are going to be making adjustments to the north-south schedules as West-East Rail comes online. So we're going to have more opportunities if you're coming from Greenfield or Northampton or Holyoke in the north to make those transfers at Springfield to go east to Boston or west to Albany in the future. These different factors that come into play, they really are at the heart of what makes a service useful and makes them competitive with vehicles.
I can just say that as a transit rider my entire life, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I went to school in New York City. Now I live here in Boston. That fast, frequent, reliable service is exactly what, as Andy said, is what's required for a quality service. It also goes beyond that. Can a visitor look at the signage and understand what they need to do? Are there people to ask? Are the stations clean? I think that's really important. So it's that whole ridership experience. The most important thing is fast, frequent, and reliable, but how does that feel doing that? Is it clean? Is it comfortable? And so those are the kinds of things that I think in our own experiences are really important. So we certainly work with Amtrak to make sure that we can improve those as much as possible as we move forward.
Thanks again to Andy Koziol and Meredith Slesinger for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.